One of the most striking features of Ardfert is the magnificent 13th century cathedral, which is built on the site of an earlier monastic settlement founded by St. Brendan in the 6th century. Between the years 1989 and 1998, major archaeological excavations and conservation works took place at Ardfert Cathedral. Archaeologists unearthed some very significant finds and gained valuable insight into what life was like in early times and right through the Middle Ages.
The main driving force behind this project was the local community, in particular the Ardfert Community Council, which was chaired at the time in the late 1980s by Kerry. The local community council had been approaching the OPW, who were responsible for the site and have done great work here in the intervening years, to try and interest them in tackling the project. Now it's a major project. And a major challenge, of course, was then getting permission from the local people who had their own flesh and blood buried here in the cathedral and the grounds, to get their permission to have the remains exhumed. And we're very fortunate. We had a great number of people. We had Father Costello, we had Florrie Carroll, Jim Healy, Mary Meehan locally, Eamon Kerry, and Father Tom Looney was involved as well, to try and get the families to give permission. And they did, which was an enormous achievement.
We started excavating here. It's Ardfert, it's the height of the burials. It was generally thought that it's built on rock, so that the modern burials, if you like, more than likely would have removed, if you like, over time, early burials, or at least early burials that might be intact and identifiable as such. And then when the South Transept was extended in the 17th century in order to turn it into the local Protestant church, if you like, or the seat of the local bishopric, that was extended into an existing graveyard. And again, in order to do that, they had to remove a certain number of burials, but then burials at a lower level running under the walls remained when we excavated, and again a couple of hundred burials there. Overall, during the excavations between the nave, the north wall, the south aisle, the south transept, excavating inside and outside the cathedral, 2,300 odd medieval burials, intact medieval to late medieval burials, were uncovered and recorded, and detailed plans made of those, which will be part of the illustration of the forthcoming volume on the excavations. So those burials, we could identify them as early medieval. Some were associated with early medieval artifacts like coins, for example, bone comb in one case dating 10th or 11th century, and you've got coins then from Ardfert dating from the 11th century right up to the 17th century.
The excavation took place because there were cracks in the walls of the 13th century cathedral, and underpinning had to take place. But as time went by, over the seasons, the entire interior of the cathedral was excavated, and the exterior all around about. Of course, it is a burial site, and we know that medieval churches, people were buried within them up until, fairly late on in the medieval period. But of course, the area around the church was also used as a burial ground, and this site is associated with St. Brendan. St. Brendan's time goes back to the 6th century, and people more than likely have been buried here from the 6th century. Now, I'm not au fait with the very early dates that may have been got from those early skeletons, but there was layer upon layer upon layer of skeletons that we excavated while we were here, and some of them were you know, sad. Well, of course, they were all sad because they represented dead people, but when it's centuries and centuries ago, you don't think too much about them. But when you find perhaps the skeleton of a woman, a mother, and the child is still in the womb, that is, of course, very poignant. And it takes a very special skill to be able to excavate that type of a remains and to draw that type of a remains. And we were very fortunate with the people working on the site that we had some excellent draftspersons, and they were able to kind of reflect what was being found in the ground. Kind of information that skeletal remains can tell us. You can work out, or the experts can work out, the age of the person at death, whether they were male or female, whether they had challenges growing up, whether they suffered from rickets, things like that, if they had strains on their body indicating that they'd carried heavy loads, if they had broken bones that healed or perhaps didn't heal, and that might have been the cause of death. All of these things can be found from skeletal remains, and certainly with a huge sample as we had here in the cathedral, all of this will be found, and we'll get information about the people of Ardfert from back in the day, from these skeletal remains.
Now, just under these lancet windows, you found a cross inscribed slab.
Yeah, it was an interesting find. You'd expect in that part of the cathedral to find later slabs, grave slabs, covering medieval tombs of bishops and important clerics and maybe abbots, etc., associated with the monastery, or with the site generally. And but that was an early medieval grave slab, a slab that probably dated anywhere from the 9th, 10th century to the 11th or 12th century at the latest, even more than likely 8th, 9th, 10th century in date. It's fits in well with the tradition of cross slabs from the early Christian period. Very often beautiful crosses were carved on fairly rough stones. They were slabs, but they weren't highly worked pieces. Very often they would just roughly dress a stone and put a cross on it and mark a grave. Sometimes they're inscribed. In Clonmacnoise, for example, there's quite a collection of inscribed slabs. That's where they'd have a name of, or pray for the soul or a particular individual. So in this particular case, there's no inscription on it, but it's a beautifully carved Latin cross with a ringed circle in the centre of the crossing point. A large, heavy slab which would have stood, and obviously very prominently, within the early monastic enclosure.
Now, Mike, over your left shoulder there is the famous Lady Dowager. What is the story of Lady Dowager? Now, the Lady Dowager herself was the wife of Lord Kerry, Patrick Fitzmaurice, and would have had the title Lady Kerry. However, her husband died, and the wife of his successor would now be known as Lady Kerry. So the wife of the earlier lord would be known henceforth as the Lady Dowager during her lifetime. Her maiden name was Honora Fitzgerald, of the powerful Fitzgerald family from the Clyne, Ballymaloe area of East Cork. In fact, she was a granddaughter of James Fitzmaurice Fitzgerald, who many people will remember from their days studying history in school. Honora donated the stones from her ruined castle for the building of this church, and it was in return for this donation that she was given the privilege of being buried within the cathedral walls, she and her posterity. She died and was buried in this tomb in 1668, as it is inscribed on top of the tomb here. But there was a lot of folklore and stories of Lady Dowager. I think, Jim, it's quite possible that a lot of the stories of the Dowager haunting the cathedral would have arisen from the fact that local parents would have sought to discourage children from coming here. In those days, it was considered quite dodgy for Catholics to be going into Church of Ireland property. So for those reasons, parents, I think, might have created the myth that the Dowager haunts the cathedral And this would have been an effort to keep the children from coming here in the evenings and at night and playing.
It's around 350 years since Lady Dowager was buried in that tomb there. And hopefully she'll be around another 500 years.
Hopefully she will, Jim, and maybe even 1,000 years. And we hope that people will still talk about her and find her interesting.
I'm just going to talk briefly about some of the folklore associated with the cathedral here in Ardfert. And these are old stories that were collected, and while they appear very simple stories, they sometimes have a deeper meaning. The story concerns the Galan stone, that area down in Kerry. And it was said that that was to be the original site for the cathedral at one point, and that while building it, the mason left down his plans for some reason, and a magpie stole them and brought them and came over to the cathedral here and dropped them. Now that seems like a very simple story, and when you hear it first, but when we look behind it, the subtext really is more or less associating perhaps a pre-Christian site with the now Christian site here at Ardfert.
During the excavations in 1991, I think it was, a major find, a burial inside the east, the east window of the cathedral, slightly flexed and not fully on the orientation of the cathedral. A male adult burial with a ring on his right hand. The ring itself had a setting in it, a carnelian setting. It's an intaglio ring or a seal ring. It had a setting of a carnelian with an image carved into that of the god Apollo, the Roman god Apollo. So it was a seal, but it was used more than likely as a seal ring and reset into a ring of maybe 11th to 12th century date. As well as that, there were 3 little glass oval pieces found around the skull of the individual, and suggesting that they were stitched into a piece of head gear or a mitre or some ornamental headpiece that would have been worn by the same individual. So indicating probably a bishop. The dating, 11th to 12th century maybe, might tie in with a historical figure we know, a bishop called David Dov Dietrich, who was Bishop of Ardfert in the late 12th century, who had to go to Rome to petition the bishop to have his status as Bishop of Ardfert recognised, because at that stage you had the beginning of a rivalry between Anglo-Norman claimants to the title of Bishop of Kerry or Ardfert and Westminster and the local native clergy. So this David Dietrich went to Rome in 1197 to see Celestine III, the Pope at the time, and was given recognition as the Bishop of Kerry and came back here. And who knows, maybe he came back here with that ring, and maybe that's the burial that we uncovered.
I suppose Finbar, one of the most unusual artefacts you found here was the pilgrim badge.
Yes, Jim, yeah, it was a great find. And one small little find like that can open up all sorts of connections between Ardfert and the wider world. We were excavating what looked like a medieval tomb within the nave of the cathedral along by the north wall, and in the course of excavating that, a number of burials were interred within that tomb, and alongside the wall of the tomb we found, on the inside we found this little pewter brooch in the shape of a scallop shell, with a little figure on it, gilded figure, of a figure of a man wearing a hat, holding a staff and with a satchel at the side, the classic sort of depiction, if you like, of St. James of Compostela. In the 14th or 15th century, these badges were made on a fairly large scale, but they were mostly pewter and fairly simple in form. But this particular one, with the little gilded figure, the pewter badge and the little brooch, is exceptional. It's from and across Europe. There are many pilgrim badges because Compostela was visited by pilgrims from all over Europe. But this little badge is exceptionally beautiful little piece, so it would have been a fairly high status person would probably have worn this.
When the excavation finished up in the 1990s, you began the big task of repairing the south wall, which the buttress and the tie bars were keeping together since 1875 when they were put there.
Now, by the time we started working on this, the ties and the plates had long since stopped working. We weren't too sure when we started off whether the buttress was still working or not. But in the course of the works, we put a pressure gauge between we actually put a modern buttress on to take over, and then we checked the connection between the wall and the, if you like, the more historic buttress, only to find that in fact the wall was relying on the buttress. So we looked at modern technologies for how we would do it. And the challenge to our engineers, who again are a local firm, if you like, Malachy Walsh and Partners, and they looked at what English Heritage had been doing as well, because this work was very innovative at the time. It's more commonplace in Ireland now, but what we wanted to do in the end was to hold this wall up but see all the architectural detail and not have it hidden. So that's kind of the history. The buttress is recorded. There's a little gravestone outside for the buttress itself. But you know, over time, you know, if these buildings have their roofs and have all the parts, much easier to hold them together. As a ruin, it's much more complicated. And interventions, you know, last until the intervention may begin to fail. And so you had the ties and the plates first, then you had the buttress, and then you had the system that we introduced. So effectively this goes right down into the rock below. It's hidden, you can't see it, but this whole wall is cantilevered off the rock, and in fact it's not going to fall. So at least when people stand back now, they'll see it as it was. It's a bit distorted, but they'll see it as it was many hundreds of years ago. So here we are at the choir end of the cathedral, and it's at this end that the greatest detail occurs. The floor here would have been timber, it would have been stepped for the choir area. So where I'm standing now is below the floor. The floor would have come in around here, and what we're looking at here are what's called the triple sedilia. So it's three sedilias, and this is where the important prelates would sit at certain times in these three niches. Some of this is original, other parts are repaired, and this is the area that we looked at all the original stone with the architectural historian from Trinity College. Just beyond this it steps up again, so there would have been another step in the ground, and you have a double piscina where you have the water.
Just looking over your shoulder there, Gwellan, there's the fantastic 12th century Romanesque doorway. Was that in a very, very bad condition?
It was in a very bad condition. We decided that a lot of the work that was done here was done with specialist contractors, but we decided for the west doorway was so special, we used our own specialists. And we did it over quite a period of time. In fact, it was one of the first things we started and one of the last things we completed. A lot of stone had been stolen out of it. at the upper levels of the blind arches, and the limestone was exposed. And one of the problems was the rain coming down and bringing there were chemicals obviously dissolving from the limestone, washing onto the sandstone, and this was creating issues of preservation for the sandstone. And you'll see over the mouldings at the top, we've put a lead tray. There's lead going all the way around, and the lead is to catch the water coming down off the limestone and to throw it away to help preserve the sandstone. So sandstone can be quite soft, so many places it's gone, but in some places it's there. And these original surfaces are really important for architectural historians, because when you look at them, you'll see how they finished off the stone originally, how they tooled it. And there's an awful lot of information there which will be important into the future. On the left side of the very end, you'll notice where the wall sticks out because this church was in a different place to the cathedral. So at the very end, we needed to support that corner. So a decision was made to finish off the fourth part to actually support the corner. The archaeologists found all the base stones in the excavation, and we just did a very, very simple reconstruction. But the reconstruction was it acts a bit like a buttress for the northwest corner of the building to hold it. So you get a kind of an idea in the 12th century of the totality of at least the doorway area into the 12th century church.
Now, Finbar, we're standing here in the rubble and what remains of the old round tower. But would it have been a large structure?
Well, we don't know how tall it was, but it was reputed to be the tallest round tower in Ireland. But it fell in 1771, so sadly we don't have a record or any dimensions for it other than that, how people perceived it at the time. Yeah, as you said, we are standing here in the rubble of the tower because even though a lot of the stones from it were removed for building houses locally or building walls locally, and as I might have told you once, Eamon Kerry brought me to a house not too far from here that was clearly built from stones from the round tower, probably shortly after it fell. It can be seen from the air very clearly. From early shots, when you look down, you can see a mound at this particular spot just to the southwest of the cathedral, and that's normally where round towers are placed, or normally placed southwest of the church and the monastery. So this location here is just southwest, so that's the right location for a round tower. As I said, you can see a mound from the air, but there's a large tomb placed in the middle of this mound, but when you walk around the out perimeter of it, you can see a lot of the stones that are typical of the stones in round towers. They're deliberately shaped to form a circular structure. When it was built, it fell in 1771. When it was built, we're not entirely sure about that either. In the 11th and 12th century, these towers were built in a number of the monasteries. These are pre-Norman kind of monastic cities and towns that existed all over Ireland, and in the 11th century and 12th century they built these towers, these round towers, possibly as places of refuge because they were very hard to climb. They could pull up the ladders or as they went up through the various floors. They were called bell towers or cligtoch, which means a bell tower or a bell house. And there's a possibility that a bell was rung from the top of the round tower, a hand bell rung from the top of the round tower to bring the monks and the lay workers in the monastery to their prayers or meals or whatever it was the particular time of day required. And they are impressive structures. They really stand out in the landscape, any that survived to this day. So this would have been like a beacon, and this is a very elevated area. So this round tower would have been seen for miles around, probably seen from the sea, seen from the general hinterland. So it would have stood out that this was Ardfert Cathedral site, and possibly in the 11th century was built when they built the stone church, or else in the 12th century when they built a Romanesque church, and they were making a claim for Ardfert being the seat of the diocese of Irmoon.
There was illustrations done by Dan Tish Tyler in the 90s. How accurate was those drawings?
Jim, they're very accurate. They're a fine set of drawings illustrating the development of the cathedral site from the 5th or 6th century right up to the 16th century. In the 5th or 6th century, he shows the foundation of the site with two small oratories on an east-west orientation, surrounded by a large enclosure, illustrating what might have been a very simply laid out monastery of the 5th or 6th century, with a burial area, religious area, if you like, and domestic areas. And then following that, he has the monastery developing in the 11th century, when there's a stone church built here. He illustrates it with a nave and a chancel. It would originally have been a simple rectangular nave or simple rectangular structure, with a nave added to it in the 12th century. And that in itself would have been a major addition to the site. A round tower probably built at the same time, and again, probably smaller churches on the site, also in the style of the great monasteries, similar to Clonmacnoise, Glendalough. It would have been like Cashel or any of the great ecclesiastical centres. And then he moves on to the 13th century, showing the cathedral as it might have been as a major ecclesiastical centre, administrative centre, with administrative buildings indicated at the west end, and the growth of a medieval town. The administrative buildings are reflective of what was at Cashel at the time, or still survives at Cashel. Whether they were here or not on that scale or of grandeur, we don't know. It shows a medieval town developing, large timber framed houses, fine houses, a big sort of town reflecting more of an English style than what we know about Ireland at the time. We don't know enough really about the buildings in medieval towns in Ireland, generally apart from stone buildings that survived, to make a really definitive call on whether or not there were timber framed houses of that sort on that scale within the medieval towns in Ireland. But at the same time, it does give you a sense of the growing importance and significance of Ardfert. And then he follows on with the 15th century development of the site, with the battlements being added, with the and a new roofing programme at the cathedral, and the building of Temple na Griffin on the site, possibly of an earlier church. In the 12th century, you also had a later monastic Romanesque church built to the west of the cathedral, and both of those survive. And they're on east-west orientation, and there's a possibility that that reflects the early orientation of the original church of the site, and that in the 11th century, when the 11th century church was built, the north wall of which still stands to this day, which I'm standing beside, the ground plan of which is visible here beside us, which we uncovered during the excavation, that was orientated on the feast of St. Brendan on the 16th of May, and that the entire orientation of the cathedral then later on that was fixed because of that association and claiming a connection with St. Brendan for Ardfert.
Now, Graham, we're inside this fantastic church, Temple na Griffin, all restored, looks absolutely beautiful. Was there a lot of work in this?
There was a lot of work in it. This church, well, there was a decision taken to restore the church because there was a huge corpus of architectural building stone which came up, which is laid out, according to the earliest right up to the latest material, and it needed to be in a very safe environment, so that it wouldn't be taken, but also in a safe environment from an environmental point of view. And we have underfloor heating here, so there's a general heat. The relative humidity is within acceptable levels, and what we decided to do was to put back a 15th century roof, because it's a 15th century building. This is a typical kind of Irish 15th century roof made of native oak and adds, so a series of large trusses, which is really very, very beautiful. When we completed this, it was lighter in colour. As it ages, it would get darker and darker. The one thing we decided to do was to put back the bell cut. This building had a bell cut, which is like a gable, elevated area at the end of a gable, at the top of a gable for the bell. And part of it was taken away and used in the south transept when it was used as a Church of Ireland church. So it was decided it should go back. We had the base of it here, we had the whole top, and there was a piece missing, so we repaired that. So that actually stands on the west gable, and it means that, as in the past, when you were further west from here or north from here, you can see Ardfert, because in fact the bellcot will stand out much more than the cathedral itself. So it means that the site can be appreciated and understood and seen from a distance like it was originally.
One of our main features here in the south transept would be this visitor centre. Here we have a model that shows people directions around our site. On the model here in front of me, we have the main cathedral, which is a 13th century building. To the west behind that, we have two separate churches, Temple na Hoe, which is a late 12th century church, and also Temple na Griffin, 15th century church, which has been restored by the Office of Public Works. An addition later on would have been the south transept here. This would have been a 17th century building.
So we're here now in the south transept, and it's a fantastic building altogether, and the roof is fantastic.
Yes.
There must have been a tremendous amount of work gone into this.
There was. It had been decided that there needed to be a visitor facility here, a facility for the guides, also to provide exhibition for some material that came up in excavation, and to have an exhibition. So you needed a roofed building to do that. This is basically a 15th century transept, very small, which was increased in the 17th century, which became, if you like, a Church of Ireland, what became Church of Ireland Church. And it was, of course, no longer roofed like anything here. So we worked we looked at existing roofs in Ireland. Now, there are very few early roofs in churches left in Ireland, which is very sad. We then drew up a list, and in fact, believe it or not, there's a bit more surviving in Northern Ireland than there is down here. So we went up and we looked at existing churches, and there was one particular church in the north of Ireland called in Warringstown. And when we went and looked at it, it was the perfect date. But not only was it the same, it was a perfect date, the span was exactly the same as here, and the distance of the trusses worked out perfectly for here. It was almost serendipitous that that was the case. So we surveyed the various churches, and this one was just the perfect model of a 17th century roof. So we took a lot of photographs and dimensions, drawing of it, and we recreated it down here. So this is an authentic looking, it's made in the 20th century, but it's an authentic a style of roofing in oak from the period. So a lot of attention went into that type of detail, and it gives people an idea of what the church would have been like here at that time. It may not be 100% correct, but it's based on this authentic roof in Warringstown in Northern Ireland.
The whole village of Ardfert is a hugely important site from an archaeological point of view, and prior to the works being carried out here in the cathedral, I suppose you could say it was a little bit neglected. But today, and from the time of the excavation, plenty of visitors came to the site, and of course now you have a wonderful visitor centre here as well, which helps tell the story of the excavation and of all the various finds that happened here, and of the history of the site, because Ardfert was such an important place, being the diocesan centre, and then right through medieval times and post-medieval times. There was in a way you could nearly say there was more history attached to this town than to Tralee, which is only down the road. It certainly during medieval times was probably of equal importance, if not more importance. But now we know the story so much better, and I think I hope that everybody is now very pleased that the excavation did take place at Ardfert, and as a monument to it, the cathedral is still standing, whereas maybe it might not have been had all those works not happened 30 years ago.
The archaeological excavations undertaken here turned out to be extremely significant. They demonstrated the importance of Ardfert Cathedral and the Ardfert complex, if you like, as not only as a place of burial, as a cathedral, and the excavation and the finds from it demonstrated the amazing connections of Ardfert across Europe through the pottery and through the ornate artefacts that were uncovered. The building itself is now standing, hopefully for another 1,000 years. The excavations themselves, I think, were unique in that no site of this nature has been excavated to this extent in the country before. It's an amazing complex now, a great place to visit. We have a story told, but there's more stories to tell about Ardfert, and maybe in the future there'll be more archaeology uncovered here to reveal more of the site and its history.